Small towns have a way of clinging to their secrets, burying them under layers of gossip, routine, and forced smiles. But every so often, something happens that can't be hidden or ignored. Something so dark and shocking that it changes the fabric of the town forever. This is the story of one such event, a tragedy that left my small town reeling and revealed the darkness hiding behind one unassuming family's door. It started on a crisp October evening, just as the sun was beginning to set and the air carried the faint smell of burning leaves. I was at home, finishing dinner with my parents, when the first sirens pierced the silence. Living in a small town, we weren't used to much excitement. Fire trucks rushing down the main street at full speed meant something serious was happening. Curiosity got the better of me, so I threw on my jacket and headed outside. From my porch, I could see the column of thick, black smoke rising against the darkening sky. It was coming from the south side of town, near the Meyer house. Kevin Meyer was a senior at my high school. He wasn't someone I knew personally, we only had a few classes together. But he was hard to miss. Quiet, awkward, and always sitting at the back of the room with his head down. Kevin didn't have many friends. He was the kind of kid who got teased relentlessly, though never loudly enough for the teachers to intervene. Most people either ignored him or laughed behind his back. The Meyer family lived in a modest house on a quiet street lined with maple trees. Kevin's dad was a mechanic, and his mom worked at the local library. They seemed like a perfectly normal family, the kind you wouldn't give a second thought to. But that night, their house became the center of the town's attention. When I arrived at the scene, a small crowd of neighbors had already gathered, standing in their driveways and on the sidewalk, watching as firefighters battled the blaze. The garage was completely engulfed in flames, the fire spreading quickly to the house itself. The glow lit up the street, and the heat was intense even from a distance. I spotted my friend Sarah among the crowd and made my way over to her. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice low. She shook her head, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "They said there was an explosion," she replied, "in the garage." Before I could ask more, a loud crack split the air, and the roof of the garage collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. The fire burned for hours before the firefighters were able to bring it under control. By then, the house was in ruins, and the neighborhood was heavy with the smell of smoke and scorched wood. The next morning, the news spread quickly. Kevin Meyer was dead. His body had been found in the garage, and the explosion had been caused by something far more sinister than an accident. It didn't take long for the rumors to start. In a town as small as ours, speculation spread like wildfire. Some people said Kevin had been experimenting with fireworks or chemicals, and that it was just a tragic accident. Others whispered about suicide, pointing to his reputation as a loner and the bullying he endured at school. But the truth turned out to be far darker than anyone imagined. As investigators sifted through the wreckage of the Meyer house, they began to piece together a story that sent shockwaves through the town. Among the charred remains of the garage, they found evidence that Kevin had been building a bomb. I remember overhearing bits and pieces of the investigation from my dad, who knew someone on the fire department. The bomb wasn't just some amateur experiment or the work of a curious teenager. It was detailed, deliberate, and deadly. Kevin had clearly spent weeks, if not months, planning and constructing it. Even more disturbing was what the investigators found next, a notebook. Inside, Kevin had outlined a chilling plan to attack the town's church during Sunday morning service. The notebook included detailed drawings, a timeline, and even a list of people he wanted to harm. The revelation hit the town like a thunderclap. How could a kid like Kevin, quiet, awkward Kevin, harbor such hatred? People who had ignored him suddenly started dissecting every interaction they'd ever had with him, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Parents whispered about the dangers of isolation and the impact of bullying, while teachers quietly reviewed their own failures to notice the signs. The police quickly classified Kevin's death as accidental. The bomb had detonated prematurely while he was working on it, killing him instantly. The blast had been so powerful that it left little of him behind, and the fire did the rest. But for me, and for many others, the case didn't feel that simple. It wasn't just the horror of what Kevin had planned. It was the question of why. What had driven him to such a dark place? And how had no one seen the warning signs? As the weeks passed, more details came to light. Kevin's parents were devastated, and his mother, in particular, struggled to cope with the fallout. She attended the church he had planned to target, and the guilt weighed heavily on her. She withdrew from the community, unable to face the whispers and judgment that followed her everywhere. I learned through Sarah that Kevin's parents had been deeply strict, the kind of people who demanded perfection and had little patience for failure. Kevin's father, in particular, was known to have a temper. While nothing had ever been officially reported, rumors circulated about shouting matches and tension in the Meyer household. Kevin's home life, combined with the relentless teasing at school, must have created a pressure cooker that eventually exploded, literally. In the end, the tragedy left the town scarred in ways we didn't fully understand at the time. The church installed security cameras and began locking its doors between services. The school implemented anti-bullying programs, though they felt hollow and performative. And the Meyer house sat abandoned for years, a blackened skeleton of what it once was, before it was finally torn down. I still think about Kevin sometimes. I think about how easy it is to ignore someone until it's too late, to look the other way because it's easier than getting involved. And I think about the fire, how it consumed everything in its path, leaving only ashes and unanswered questions behind. Small towns like ours pride themselves on being safe, close-knit communities. But sometimes, beneath the surface, there's a darkness that no one wants to acknowledge. Kevin's story is a reminder that even the quietest places can hide the loudest horrors, and that sometimes, the people you least expect are the ones capable of unimaginable things. This chilling account explores the darkness lurking behind a small-town tragedy, a reminder of how isolation, pressure, and neglect can build into something catastrophic. Small towns are often quiet, peaceful places where everyone knows everyone. But sometimes, they hold dark secrets, buried beneath polite smiles and neighborhood barbecues. My town learned this the hard way one fateful winter, when the brutal murder of a family of 4 shocked us all, and revealed a horrifying truth that still haunts me to this day. It started on a bitterly cold January morning. Snow blanketed the streets, muffling every sound, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. I was sipping my coffee and trying to warm up when my police scanner crackled to life. The voice on the other end was urgent and shaken. "We've got a 10 to 16 at 23 Maple Avenue. Family of 4. All deceased." Maple Avenue was one of the nicer parts of town, lined with well-kept homes and perfectly manicured lawns. Hearing about a disturbance there was rare enough, let alone something this serious. I threw on my coat and headed out, not knowing that I was about to step into the most disturbing case of my career. When I arrived at the house, it was already swarming with officers and paramedics. The yellow crime scene tape flapped in the icy wind as neighbors huddled in their driveways, whispering to each other with pale faces. I recognized a few of them and nodded in acknowledgement as I ducked under the tape and entered the house. Inside, the scene was worse than I could have imagined. The family, Mark and Lisa Davis, along with their 2 children, Emily and Sarah, were sprawled across the living room. Mark was slumped in his recliner, his eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Lisa was on the couch, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Both had deep gashes across their throats. But it was the children who broke me. Emily, 9 years old, and Sarah, only 7, were lying side by side on the carpet, their hands clasped together. Their faces were pale, and their small frames looked almost peaceful, if not for the unmistakable marks of violence on their necks. I turned away, fighting the nausea rising in my stomach. The air in the house felt suffocating, heavy with the metallic smell of blood. One of the detectives on the scene, a grizzled man named Frank, approached me, his expression grim. "It's bad," he said simply. "Real bad." "What do we know?" I asked, trying to focus on the facts. "Not much yet," Frank admitted. "No sign of forced entry. Whoever did this either knew them or found a way to get in quietly." I nodded, glancing back at the scene. The house was spotless. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the family had been taken completely by surprise. Over the next few days, the town spiraled into panic. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some people said it was the work of a drifter or transient who had passed through town, targeting the Davis family at random. Others whispered about a personal vendetta, suggesting that Mark or Lisa might have been hiding something. But no one could imagine what could provoke such a horrific act. The autopsies provided a chilling detail. The family had been poisoned before they were killed. Traces of a lethal substance were found in their systems, suggesting they'd been incapacitated before their throats were slit. The calculated nature of the crime sent shivers down everyone's spines. Then came the discovery that changed everything. While searching the house for clues, detectives found a small notebook hidden under Emily's bed. It was a typical diary, filled with drawings and childish handwriting, but one page stood out. It was a list, written in shaky but legible letters. Make them sleep. Use the knife. Say goodbye. The handwriting was a perfect match to Emily's school assignments. At first, no one could believe it. Emily? The sweet, soft-spoken 9-year-old who always played quietly in the front yard? The idea was absurd. But as investigators delved deeper, the evidence became harder to ignore. The poison used to incapacitate the family had been mixed into their evening tea, a routine the Devises followed every night. A small bottle containing traces of the substance was found hidden in Emily's room. Her fingerprints were all over it. The knife used in the murders, still smeared with blood, was discovered in the backyard, buried beneath the snow. Emily's tiny fingerprints were found on the handle. The case was becoming horrifyingly clear. Emily had murdered her entire family. The town was in shock. People who had known the Devises for years refused to believe it. They clung to the idea that someone else must have forced Emily to do it, that maybe she'd been manipulated or threatened. But there was no evidence to support that theory. The official story concluded that Emily, for reasons we'll never fully understand, had planned and carried out the murders herself. Psychologists speculated about possible motives: resentment, mental illness, or some kind of trauma no one had noticed. But there were no warning signs, no history of abuse, no behavioral issues. Emily's teachers described her as a quiet, polite student who never caused trouble. And then there was the final, chilling twist. Emily's body was found in the backyard, just a few feet from where the knife had been buried. She'd collapsed in the snow and frozen to death during the night. Her cause of death was listed as hypothermia, but the circumstances were baffling. It was as if, after committing the murders, she'd wandered outside in a trance and simply laid down to die. Some in town believed it was guilt, that Emily couldn't live with what she'd done and chose to end her own life. Others whispered darker theories, suggesting that something had driven her to commit the crime, and when it was over, it left her with nothing. The Davis house was abandoned after the murders, sitting empty for years. Neighbors avoided walking past it, and children crossed to the other side of the street. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from the property, soft footsteps, faint laughter, or the sound of a child crying. One family tried to move in a few years later, but they didn't last long. They left in the middle of the night, refusing to talk about what had driven them away. The house was eventually demolished, but even now, the land feels tainted. I still think about the Davis family often, especially Emily. How could a little girl commit such an act? What could have driven her to it? The case remains the darkest chapter in our town's history, a haunting reminder that sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under the bed. They're the ones you least expect. This chilling story of betrayal and unimaginable violence reveals the fragile lines between innocence and darkness, leaving questions that will never truly be answered. The late 1990s were a simpler time, at least in our small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. There was little crime, and most people left their doors unlocked at night. The only real excitement came from weekend yard sales, high school football games, and the occasional bear sighting. But one incident in the summer of 1998 would shatter the illusion of safety for everyone, and it all started with my grandmother. Grandma lived in a remote cabin deep in the woods, a place she and Grandpa had built together back in the 1960s. After Grandpa passed away, she refused to leave the cabin, even as her health started to decline. She was stubborn like that, independent to the end. My mom checked in on her regularly, and I visited whenever I could, but most of the time, she was alone. That summer, I spent a lot of time at her cabin, helping with chores and keeping her company. One evening, as I was heading home, she stopped me on the porch and handed me a plate of leftovers. "Take this to your mom," she said with a warm smile, "and don't forget to visit me next week." "Of course, Grandma," I replied, giving her a hug before driving off. I didn't know it at the time, but that would be the last time I'd see her before the night that changed everything. It was 2 weeks later when my mom called, her voice tight with worry. "I haven't been able to reach Grandma all day," she said. "Can you go check on her?" I agreed immediately, grabbing my keys and heading out the door. The drive to the cabin was long and winding, the dirt road flanked by thick trees on both sides. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the path, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I arrived, the cabin looked untouched, but something didn't feel right. The front door was closed but not locked, which was unusual for Grandma. She was always careful about keeping it latched. "Grandma?" I called out as I stepped inside. The air was still, and the only sound was the creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet. The cabin was dimly lit, with the last rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. "Grandma, it's me," I said again, louder this time. I made my way through the living room and into the kitchen, where I found her sitting at the table. Relief washed over me. She looked unharmed, though she was unusually pale. "Grandma, are you okay?" I asked, pulling out a chair to sit beside her. She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide and filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Just tired." I could tell she was lying. "What happened?" I pressed. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a trembling voice, she began to tell me about the stranger who had appeared at her door the night before. It was late, close to midnight, and she had already gone to bed. The sound of knocking woke her up, startling her out of a deep sleep. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it came again. Slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the cabin. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No answer. She grabbed the old shotgun Grandpa had left behind and cautiously approached the door. Peering through the window, she saw a man standing on the porch. He was in his mid-30s, with scruffy hair and clothes that looked worn and dirty. He didn't appear threatening, but there was something about him that put her on edge. "Can I help you?" she asked, keeping the door firmly shut. The man looked up at her, his expression calm but intense. "My car broke down up the road," he said. "Can I use your phone?" Grandma hesitated. She didn't like the idea of letting a stranger inside, but it was late, and he seemed desperate. After a moment's thought, she cracked the door open and handed him the cordless phone. He stood on the porch, dialing a number while she watched from inside. She couldn't hear the conversation, but he spoke quietly for a few minutes before handing the phone back. "Thank you," he said, smiling faintly. "I appreciate it." She nodded, ready to close the door, but then he said something that made her blood run cold. "You're kind," he said, "not like the others." Grandma didn't know what to say. The man lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning the cabin as if memorizing every detail. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? What did he mean by not like the others? And why did he seem so familiar? The next morning, she found a note tucked under the door. Written in neat, precise handwriting, it said, "Thank you for your kindness. You're safe now." Grandma showed me the note, her hands trembling as she held it out. My stomach churned as I read the words, a sense of dread settling over me. Something about the man's behavior, his calm demeanor, didn't sit right. A few days later, the news broke. Eric Robert Rudolph, the notorious Olympic Park bomber, had been spotted in the area. He had been hiding in the Appalachian wilderness for years, evading authorities while continuing to live off the grid. When Grandma saw his photo on the news, she froze. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the man who came to my door." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Rudolph was one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, a man responsible for multiple bombings and the deaths of innocent people. And he had been standing on Grandma's porch, asking to use her phone. The realization was almost too much to process. Grandma had unknowingly come face to face with one of the most dangerous men in the country and survived. But the part that haunted me the most was his note. "You're safe now." What did he mean by that? Why had he spared her? In the years that followed, I often thought about that night. Rudolph was eventually captured in 2003, but the questions surrounding his visit to Grandma's cabin were never answered. I sometimes wonder if he saw something in her, a kindness that reminded him of someone he had lost or a humanity he had long since abandoned. Whatever the reason, Grandma's encounter remains one of the most chilling stories in our family's history. It's a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, danger can lurk just beyond the porch light, waiting to knock on your door. This harrowing tale blends real-life terror with the haunting mystery of a fleeting encounter, leaving lingering questions about morality, survival, and the choices we make when faced with the unknown. Every small town has its ghost stories, legends whispered around campfires, passed down through generations. Most of them are harmless, exaggerated tales meant to scare kids into behaving or to add a touch of mystery to a quiet town. But in my town, one story wasn't just a tale. It was a tragedy, a haunting, and a reminder that some scars never heal. This is the story of the old iron bridge and the young girl who could never escape it. The bridge was built in the early 1900s, a narrow iron structure spanning the slow-moving river that snaked through the town. It connected the older, rural side of town to the more developed area, and over time, it became an unassuming part of the landscape. Most people didn't think much about it until the night of the attack. It happened in the summer of 1984, long before I was born. Two teenage girls, Emily and Rachel, were walking home after a late-night swim at the river. They were best friends, practically inseparable, and known throughout the town as sweet, fun-loving kids. That night, as they crossed the bridge, they were ambushed by two men. No one knows exactly what happened on the bridge that night. Emily's parents reported her missing the next morning, and Rachel was found clinging to life on the riverbank, bruised, battered, and barely conscious. The men had beaten her, then thrown both girls off the bridge into the water below. Rachel survived. Emily didn't. The town was shaken to its core. Crimes like this didn't happen here, not in our safe, sleepy little community. The police launched an investigation, but the attackers were never caught. Rachel's memory of the incident was hazy, fragmented by trauma, and with no witnesses or solid evidence, the case went cold. The bridge became a symbol of grief and fear, a place people avoided after dark. Over time, rumors started to spread. People claimed to see a girl in a white dress standing on the bridge at night, staring into the water. Others swore they heard whispers and faint sobbing as they crossed. It wasn't long before the bridge earned its nickname, the Haunted Bridge. Rachel and her family moved away not long after the attack, trying to leave the tragedy behind them. For years, the bridge and its ghostly reputation faded into the background of town life. But in 1996, more than a decade after the attack, Rachel came back. She was in her late 20s by then, married with two young children. Her husband had grown up in the area, and they decided to settle down in the town where she had spent her childhood. It seemed like a fresh start, a way to make peace with her past. But the past didn't let go so easily. At first, everything seemed fine. Rachel and her family bought a house not far from the bridge, and she seemed happy. She joined a local church, reconnected with old friends, and even started volunteering at the library. But as the months passed, people began to notice a change in her. She became withdrawn, often staring off into the distance as if lost in thought. She avoided the bridge at all costs, even taking long detours to avoid crossing it. When someone asked her why, she would just shake her head and say, "I can't." Her husband tried to comfort her, but she grew increasingly restless. She began having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat and muttering about the bridge. She told friends that she felt like she was being watched, like something was calling her back to the place where it all happened. One night, during the height of summer, Rachel's husband woke up to find her side of the bed empty. He checked the house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Panic set in as he realized the front door was slightly ajar. He grabbed a flashlight and set out to search for her, his heart racing. Something told him to head for the bridge. When he arrived, his worst fears were confirmed. Rachel was standing in the middle of the bridge, her white nightgown glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Rachel!" he shouted, running toward her. She didn't respond. She was staring down at the water, her expression distant and blank. As he got closer, he saw tears streaming down her face. "Rachel, come back," he pleaded, reaching out to grab her arm. She turned to look at him, and for a moment, he swore her eyes weren't her own. They were hollow, almost lifeless, as if she were staring right through him. "I can't leave her," she whispered. "She's still down there." Before he could stop her, she climbed onto the edge of the bridge and jumped. He screamed and dove into the water after her, but it was too late. Rachel's body was found the next morning, tangled in the weeds along the riverbank, the same spot where she had been found all those years ago. The town was devastated. Rachel had fought so hard to move on, to build a new life, but something had pulled her back to that bridge. Some said it was survivor's guilt, the weight of living when her best friend hadn't. Others believed it was something darker, that the spirit of Emily had been calling to her, unable to rest until Rachel joined her. Whatever the truth, the bridge's reputation as a haunted place only grew stronger after Rachel's death. People reported seeing not one, but two figures on the bridge at night, one in a white dress and the other in a nightgown. Drivers claimed their radios would cut out as they crossed, replaced by faint whispers and static. A few even said they saw handprints appear on their car windows as they passed. The town eventually put up a metal fence along the sides of the bridge, hoping to prevent further tragedies. But even that didn't stop the stories. To this day, people avoid the bridge after sunset, unwilling to risk encountering whatever lingers there. I've crossed the bridge a few times myself, always during the day. It's just a bridge, I tell myself, a simple structure of iron and wood. But every time I step onto it, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. And when I look down at the water, I can't help but wonder if Emily and Rachel are still there, waiting. The haunted bridge is more than just a ghost story. It's a reminder of the pain and loss our town has endured, a scar that will never fully heal. And every time the wind whistles through the iron beams, I hear it as a whisper, a voice calling out from the past, telling us not to forget. This tragic tale of loss, guilt, and haunting captures the lingering pain of unresolved trauma and how some places carry the weight of the past long after the people are gone. Every town has its dark corners, places you hear about but instinctively avoid. For the small community of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, that darkness wasn't just a rumor or a ghost story. It was real, and it had a name, David Parker Ray, known infamously as the Toy Box Killer. This is the story of his horrific crimes, how he was finally caught, and the scars he left behind. The case began in March 1999, but the seeds of Ray's reign of terror had been planted long before. A local mechanic and government employee, Ray was known around town as a quiet, unassuming man who lived a relatively modest life. He worked on cars, kept to himself, and didn't raise suspicion. But behind closed doors, he was something far more sinister. A predator with a mind twisted by unimaginable darkness. Ray's home was located in Elephant Butte, a neighboring area near the town's reservoir. To the outside world, it looked like any other home. But hidden inside a soundproof trailer on the property was what Ray called his toy box. This trailer, later dubbed the torture chamber by investigators, was a meticulously designed space filled with implements of torture. It was equipped with chains, restraints, surgical tools, and other devices too horrific to describe in detail. On the walls were diagrams and instructions, and there were recordings Ray had created to play for his victims, a chilling monologue welcoming them to their worst nightmare. Ray's method was as calculated as it was cruel. He targeted vulnerable women, those who were often overlooked, such as sex workers or individuals struggling with addiction. Many of them were lured into his trap with the promise of safety or assistance, only to find themselves imprisoned in the toy box. For years, women went missing in and around the area, but without clear evidence or witnesses, the cases went cold. Some of these women were dismissed as runaways or transient individuals who had simply moved on. Others were never reported missing at all. It wasn't until 1999 that the truth began to surface, thanks to the bravery of one victim, Cynthia Vigil. Cynthia's ordeal began when she was approached by Ray and his girlfriend, Cindy Hindi, who offered her a ride. Trusting them was her first mistake. They quickly overpowered her, using a stun gun to subdue her before taking her to the toy box. There, she endured 3 days of unspeakable torment, bound and gagged, while Ray and Hindi carried out their depraved acts. But Cynthia was strong. She waited for an opportunity to escape, watching their every move and memorizing the layout of the trailer. Her chance came on the 3rd day, when Ray left for work and Hindi made a critical mistake. Leaving the keys to Cynthia's restraints unattended, Hindi turned her back for just a moment. It was all Cynthia needed. She managed to free herself and, in a desperate burst of adrenaline, attacked Hindi with an ice pick before fleeing the trailer. Naked, bleeding, and in a state of sheer panic, Cynthia ran down the dusty road leading away from Ray's property. She eventually flagged down a passerby, who immediately called the police. When officers arrived, Cynthia recounted her harrowing experience in vivid detail, describing the toy box and the horrors she had endured. Her story was so unbelievable that at first, some officers struggled to accept it. But a search of Ray's property confirmed everything and more. When investigators entered the toy box, they were horrified by what they found. The trailer was a chamber of horrors straight out of a nightmare. Chains hung from the ceiling, a wooden contraption designed to immobilize victims was bolted to the floor, and every surface seemed to have been meticulously arranged to facilitate Ray's twisted fantasies. The audio recordings he used to terrorize his victims were also found, their content so chilling that seasoned officers couldn't listen to them for more than a few seconds at a time. The case against Ray was overwhelming, but as investigators dug deeper, they realized the true extent of his crimes. Evidence suggested that Ray had been abducting, torturing, and murdering women for decades. Diaries found in the trailer detailed his actions, and photos of unidentified women hinted at victims who had never been reported missing. Some of the evidence suggested that Ray had accomplices beyond Hindi, though the exact number of people involved remains uncertain. Despite the mountain of evidence, Ray maintained his innocence. He claimed that everything in the toy box was consensual and part of a role-playing scenario, a defense that was quickly dismantled in court. Cindy Hindi, hoping to reduce her own sentence, cooperated with the authorities and provided damning testimony against Ray. One of the most chilling aspects of the case was the sheer number of potential victims. While Ray was convicted of crimes against Cynthia Vigil and 2 other survivors, authorities believe he may have been responsible for the deaths of as many as 60 women. However, due to the lack of bodies, many of which Ray is believed to have disposed of in Elephant Butte Reservoir, the true scope of his crimes may never be known. In 2001, Ray was sentenced to 224 years in prison. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served. But in a cruel twist of fate, Ray died of a heart attack just a year into his sentence, taking many of his secrets to the grave. The aftermath of the case left a lasting scar on the community. Truth or Consequences was no longer just a quirky town with an unusual name. It was the site of one of the most disturbing serial killer cases in American history. The toy box was dismantled, its contents cataloged as evidence and stored away. But its memory lingers, a grim reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight. For me, this story is more than just a piece of local history. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers and the importance of vigilance. It's also a testament to the strength and resilience of survivors like Cynthia Vigil, who fought back against unimaginable odds and brought a monster to justice. The toy box killer's reign of terror may be over, but his legacy serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the quietest towns. This horrifying account sheds light on the chilling reality of one man's atrocities, the bravery of his survivors, and the enduring impact of his crimes on a small town forever marked by his actions.